real-time web. So how many of you actually looked at the Facebook, updated your status, or tweeted today? How many of you did it in the last 1 hour? How many of you are doing it right now? Thank you for listening to me. But I know we can all multitask, so it's okay. So real-time web, it's really, really now it's part of our life. So I'm really, really excited to tonight's topic. It is my privilege to introduce and present to you Dr. Andreas Weigend. He's also known as Dr. Data. He received his PhD from Stanford on experimental physical health. So he has a physicist by training. He's a physicist by training. And after Stanford, he worked at Wall Street for companies such as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley while he was teaching at NYU. So he was associate professor there. And he then co-founded a Web2 music metadata company called Mood Logic. It was sold to Macrovision. And then he was a chief scientist at a web company that you may not know. It's called Amazon.com. And now he works with people in data startups, such as Mr. Tweet or Scout. So he is a very busy person. He travels around, and often he's in Asia, Shanghai, and his own world, Weigend.com. So we're very, very honored to have him here tonight. Please join me, welcome Dr. Andreas Weigend.
Okay, it's actually my honor to be here, and having talked about Mood Logic, I also would like to thank VLAB, specifically Luis Velasquez, who actually was one of the oldest VLAB people I actually knew. Before helping introduce the panel, my task is to spend 10 minutes telling you not what I did in my summer vacation, but what we did in class today, because the class today was about the real-time web. It's called the Social Data Revolution class, it's MS&E 237, and the notes you see here didn't exist an hour ago. That is sort of just-in-time learning. So I want to start with some facts, and I want to split this into the production of data, the distribution of data, and the consumption. So just think about doubly, you have a sender, you have a channel, and you have a receiver. I've talked for 1 minute now. In that 1 minute, 100,000 blog posts went up. I have to disappoint you, 90% of those in Asia. 40,000 tweets went up, and I wonder, why do people tweet? And I think it's brilliant, because Twitter knows about the illusion of an audience. I have 1,000 Twitter friends, and the reason I tweet is I think I have 1,000 people listening. Whenever I use Bitly, I realize, it's the illusion of an audience. 40,000 Bitly URLs were created in this minute, and I just talked to the Foursquare CEO yesterday, roughly 1,000 Foursquare check-ins happened. So think about this, as many Bitly URLs got created in the last minute as many people tweeted, not bad. Now, let's talk about the second element, distribution, because as we said, me just creating stuff doesn't really make all that much of a difference. Distribution is where the really interesting stuff has happened. Now, what I want people to think about who are entrepreneurs here is, why do people distribute? What are the incentives? And I think one, and this is what I learned from Ming Yao, one important incentive is to have self-metrics, to give people feedback. That's another thing Bitly is actually doing. We heard some stories from Todd in this. And giving people the chance to do experiments. As Aiko said, I'm an experimental physicist by training, so I always think about stuff and then I do experiments. And it's awesome that the web enables us to do that. The last point here is that for distribution, I think, as a physicist would say, second-order effects matter. So it doesn't really matter what I write, but what matters is where do I give my attention to what I distribute. I was an early advisor to Delicious before they were sold to Yahoo, and Delicious is a good example of second-order effects, of me providing metadata about something. So we have creation, and this is about explicit creation here, of course, the implicit creation of us carrying mobile devices, cell phones, for instance, which create much more data, instrumenting the world. The parking spots in Shanghai, for instance, are instrumented that you know how long the car has been standing there. Cars in Singapore are instrumented, all of them with GPS, so your money, if you're driving too fast, gets automatically taken from your bank account. So these are all examples of data creation where we just see the beginning. Real-time creation, it appears right away from a data account. Third point is, of course, consumption. Roughly, I think there are about 4 million queries across search engines per minute. 100,000 beta links click per minute, and also roughly 100,000 product searches at that company I could mention, Amazon.com. Not bad for a company with 7 people, Bitly, to get about 5% or 2% of all the traffic search engines see. So I'm looking forward to hearing the secrets from you how that worked. So, as you know, I'm a physicist, I think about timescales. So there's a timescale of creation of data, and it's roughly the data double every 1.5 years. That means it's about a factor of 10 every 5 years, or a factor of 100 every 10 years. Now, this is both implicitly created data as well as explicitly, actively contributed data. So you might wonder, what are sort of the limits of that? And there is one limit, namely the speed of light. Real time, thankfully, is limited by speed of light. Does it matter anymore? The answer is yes. My physics TA from here, Mark Mueller, who now runs a quite good hedge fund called GMO in Boston, told me that the location of his server for the trading model he is running, the distance between that server and where the trades get executed at the co-location facility makes a huge difference to the quality of his model in the execution. So speed of light for real time actually does matter in cases like in Wall Street trading, high frequency models. Now, what I'm more interested here, however, because we are probably not building those models here today, is what happens in the time scales of consumption. What are the invariances where we consume data? What's hardwired for us? And on what timescales do those things change? Also, on what timescale do social norms change? I want to point out a little survey I did in my class, which was done by a friend of mine in Singapore. If anybody wants an intern, I promised him Chuan Yang Chi is his name. 3 months intern for the summer. He's happy to do anything interesting here. So he did that survey. And one of the really interesting questions he had is, what is your expectation of receiving a response, let's say to an email, from a close friend, from an acquaintance, somebody you don't know, or from a company? I was teaching in the executive MBA program at Tsinghua in INSEAD last month. It was very surprising to me that the majority of people there expect a response faster from companies than from their friends. So the notion of social capital, which I think is a key notion for us here, of getting responses. So capital means you get people to do stuff for you. Social capital means, without paying, you get people to do stuff for you. And that reciprocity, which is very, very common here, actually seems to be different in different contexts. In my Stanford class, 75% expect an answer faster from a close friend than from a company or a remote acquaintance. So very interesting. The other thing is, we ask them by memory, how many friends do you have? Remember that illusion of an audience? And then we actually ran the API and compared that. Surprising how people overestimate even the number. Which brings us to human evolution. Evolutionary psychology tells us that ultimately the reason why we do things is to spread our DNA. And we really evolved to be good at that, I hear. So now the question is, those things which served us well as we lived in caves, not necessarily us, but our ancestors, like when there's a little piece of information showing up in real time to run or to check it out, those things kill us now. Because if we did this, we wouldn't get any work done. So one of the questions really is, are we able as humans to evolve, or do we need companies that help us evolve with, dealing with real-time information? And for that, the question is, what data sources do actually those companies have? They are temporal data sources, and I had a blog post last year from a MBA student in my class who went to Amazon, the crux of chronology, or the sorry state of relevance, where temporal data is the main thing. Recency is supposed to relevance. Social, a totally different data source, which helps us dealing with real-time data. Facebook, of course, in this brilliance of distribution, having really changed the world there. Context, I see people pulling out their mobile phones here. So context, of course, is another example that if I am hanging out at SFO waiting for flight 888 to arrive to pick up my friend from Beijing, it's super important for me that that flight is another 7 hours late, or what the average is in United. Are they still in business? United. On the other hand, if I am not waiting there, I couldn't care less. Content, which almost brings me to the first introduction, Jan Pedersen, who has been doing content stuff in search for the last 20-something years. Our first paper was 20 years ago, right, Tom? And then, of course, metadata, which is how do we get people to actually annotate stuff? That, for me, is the atomization of data, that we make it trivial, easy, in real time for people to add stuff, to annotate stuff, to create metadata. One thing I forgot in class today, and thus didn't make it onto this one here, is the RTX model, or the RTN model. Why don't we, when we retweet something, add an integer after that RT, which tells us not how important it is for us, but how important it is for our, illusion of an audience, for all our followers to actually read that. I just got an email, I was just checking right now, about the women's bathroom in Termin is closed tonight for an emergency. So, and that was important. And I could picture the lady sitting with a handbag as you just flushed it and whatever happened. But I tend not to go to the women's bathroom. Actually, I have to be honest, never been to the women's bathroom. And I wonder, how does she think that's important for me? So RTN means the expected benefit for your audience. Get people to create those metadata. The perspective I always want to push is to take the perspective of the user, and to really take the perspective of the user, not just to pretend to take the perspective of the user. So as I'm going to move to the panel here, there are a couple of questions which I do want people to think about. What actually changed and what remains constant? I gave a talk on the new data economy about 6 weeks ago in San Francisco at the Predictive Analytics Conference. And when I actually did my little bit of research, seeing what people had written about this, I came across a paper from 1974 by Jack Hirschheifer, who was the editor of the Journal of Finance for many years, where he had a paper on the new data economy, or the new information economics, as he called it. So some of the questions he asked haven't changed at all. What changed, what remains constant? So any company I want to talk to here should really have an answer of how they leverage what has changed against the backdrop, which hasn't changed. The second question I'm pushing always very, very hard on people is, how does your product help people make better decisions? Of course, for the better decisions, for the better, we need metrics, we need to understand what is better. But if we push that aside, if it has no impact on people's decisions, why would you expect anybody to pay for it? In decision analysis, one of the things you learn is that you should pay for data, for real-time data and for other data, only as much as those data have an impact on the decision you're making. So if you say, oh, people should care, but they don't care, that's bad news. And when we say people, we mean both individuals, and I forgot to put actually it on the page here. There's a company, a startup I'm on the board at called Scout.com, S-K-O-U-T, which is one of like Grindr, which is one of the companies where you know who is around here and you know whether they're available, you know what I mean. And very, very interesting. How do they help you make decisions? Actually, don't crank up right now. Please stay focused here. The other one is, of course, how do companies make better decisions? How can companies do experiments? So if your product doesn't help, and I don't want to read it down, 73 products which we have alone in this Twitter universe on coming up with metrics. If they don't help people making decisions, we probably don't expect them to make a lot of money. And the last question here is really, what is your data strategy? And for me, the data strategy means primarily, how do we get people to actually knowingly and willingly contribute data? I call this social data, data I create and share. It's very different from, companies wanting to sniff the digital exhaust in order to, I don't know, make some decision or something. So those are the questions which I would like to ask people here. That's all in terms of introduction. What I now want to turn to is, and we probably should have the lights now on our panel here. I want to first talk to Todd Levy. Todd and I, we met at DLD in Germany, and he is the head of product and engineering at Bitly. And as you saw from the numbers here, pretty impressive how they get 2 or 3% as much in terms of clicks as all the search engines get together. How did the company start it? Tell us your story a little bit. What makes you excited? What were the surprises?
Sure. So Bitly started as a project inside a company called BetaWorks. BetaWorks is a company that both invests in companies. It has a seed stage portfolio of about 24 companies, and it also builds products internally. Bitly was one of those internal products. There were probably a number of reasons that Bitly got started, but one influencing factor was actually some of the portfolio companies we were working with. A lot of them work in the social space. A lot of them were distributing messages over various social networks, and they were attempting to get a handle on response and the effectiveness of the campaigns. And they kind of came to us and they said, there's really no decent way of tracking this. At the same time, we were working on some other projects, actually, that necessitated a neural shortener. And we said, well, why don't we bundle the two concepts together? So, Bitly's humble origins really took place. Bitly's humble origins really took place with that simple concept, which was to allow people to wrap objects, wrap links, track them transparently, and make that data completely publicly available.
Who of you has used Bitly? Who of you, for example, has used Bitly today? Not bad. We talked about complexity of the product, and if I understood you right, the most important thing is to make the product as complex as you can, so people can get everything they possibly want out of it. Or did I get that wrong?
Yes, we throw everything in and then let people sort it out. No. So when we actually launched the product, there was a lot more that we were exposing. There's a lot of metadata around every link. We were running entity extractions and geolocation extractions on the content of the page, and media type and cache content and things of that nature. And while it's all fascinating and wonderful, and we actually hope to surface some more of that content in more interesting ways in the future, we found out from our user base very quickly that really what mattered to them was the metrics, was being able to measure the output and effectiveness of the communications they were sending out. And on top of that, the latency was important. The very, very first rev of Bitly that went out the door had a metrics engine that wasn't quite real time. It was relatively brief, but it was not real time. It was on order of a couple of minutes. And pretty early on, a couple of people came to us and said, can't you just make this real time? So we said, sure, why not? And we did. And that was kind of continued story along the early days of Bitly's growth and development. The user base essentially dictated to us what was important in the product, and we just had to take the time to listen and follow through on it.
By the way, I should encourage people to take pens, to fill your questions onto the yellow cards you have, to pass them to the volunteers. It will all get to Hiroshi, who then screens them, and if we can read them, probably will pass them to me. So write legibly. The others want to chime in. Actually, maybe Jan, since you're sitting closest to me. Jan got his PhD at Stanford. He is a professional chief scientist. So we were at Park together in the early 90s. Then at some stage, he was the chief scientist at Yahoo for search. then at A9, which is an Amazon.com company for search, and now he's the head of product. Now he's the chief scientist for core search at Microsoft. Comments on what you heard? I saw you writing things down as I was talking, probably all the things I was wrong at.
So for Bitly, I'm always sort of interested in determining what the moat to competition is. I mean, so presumably a lot of people could clone a sort of similar technology, many people have. What makes you believe strongly that you'll succeed in face of that kind of competition?
I think it's only natural, especially in today's environment where data passes so much more easily than it used to assume that people can come along and essentially clone your product, clone your feature set. It's really a matter of making the right product decisions and ensuring a high level of reliability. Another factor, to be honest, coming into the market was that there were some pre-existing shorteners in the space, and they weren't able to provide the level of reliability that consumers and customers needed. So one of the differentiating factors for us, even as we got to rapid large scale, was being able to provide that reliability. And bottom line is, you can't simply build a product and then sit on your laurels. The market and the landscape will change, so you just have to keep moving your product forward and give the consumers what they want.
So it's systems competence.
I think so. I think that's one part of it. It's systems competence and not taking your users for granted.
Kevin, we met at eTech a few years ago, I remember, and we realized we got screwed by the same person, so that brought us together here. But we wouldn't want to talk about this here, but the Valley has a reputation. Happy to see you here. Kevin is the CEO and founder of Spinner. Spinner is actually a plumbing company. And I always say when you need a plumber, get a plumber. Do you want to talk us what plumbing Spinner does?
Oh, sure. So we provide, we power a lot of real-time search companies. So there's other data besides just Twitter. There's blogs, and with blogs, there's lots of spam and there's lots of protocol issues. And I think in my past, I was more of a protocol geek. I'm more of a CEO now, but there's lots of protocol issues, and so we help our customers deal with all the protocol issues and the spam, and just push we have a real-time stream we push directly to search engines, and then we have lots of search engines that are powered on us. You've probably heard of all the customers. We're like the startup that everybody uses but nobody knows about. So, is that a good answer?
It's a good starting point. It's good. So finally, we have George Zachary here, who's a partner at Charles River Ventures and has some investments in the real-time space. Do you want to talk us about someone?
Sure, yeah. I'm one of the original investors in Twitter. I'm also the original and biggest investor in a company called Yammer, which is Twitter for the enterprise, and another company called Webaroo, which has a property in India called SMS Gupshup, which in India is being called the Twitter of India. And real-time messaging has always been something I've been interested in. And I would say the one that at the beginning, when we first invested in Twitter, people thought we were insane. And I remember in our partners meeting, it was very controversial. Like half the people thought it was the stupidest thing ever, and the other half thought it was the best thing ever. And one of the things we've seen is that probably the most interesting ideas have a very polarized voting in our partnership, because we believe that the big breakouts come from the things that people think are not the eventual and the probable, but the unexpected. And that's actually part of our investing strategies. When we all say yes around the table, we all get spooked because we think something's wrong.
To what degree does any of you take into account that on the consumption side, ultimately we have people? And is it about interpreting the information which is coming along? Because we are not computers. We try to tell stories. We try to interpret what we see. And as I always say in my statistics classes, we are good in seeing patterns, whether they're there or not. So how do you guys, in all four cases, do you have a user model for search? Do you have a user model? So I want to learn a little bit more about whether this element that's ultimately people consuming stuff and people making decisions, how that enters in your decisions about funding companies, in your product decisions.
Well, mine's actually the easy one, which is what we like to look at is we like to see in the early development of a company just fanatical users, people who love the product, who will end up marketing the product inadvertently because of their passion and love for it. And that definitely happened in the early days of Twitter. So we don't look at the amount of users at the beginning, at the early stage. We look at, are the users completely engaged and do they love this? And then over a period of months, we basically, of the companies we track before we fund them, we actually look to see what the user growth rate is in those companies. And we use those data to come up with a pattern based on our own intuition and gut feeling and luck to figure out which are the more interesting companies to invest in. I'd like to tell you it's a deterministic science, but investing in early stage companies is not. And we continue to see a lot of really interesting real-time messaging companies and real-time web companies. We funded a company recently called Blippy, which a lot of people thought was the stupidest thing ever, and a lot of people thought was like incredibly awesome. And it was, again, super controversial in our partners meeting, and this is one where the users actually list their financial transactions. They sign up their Amazon account or their credit card accounts, and it actually publishes everything you buy. And it turns out in our partnership, the people above 45, I'm 44, the people above 45 thought it was crazy, and the people below 45 thought it was awesome. And there's there's something about a human need basis about publishing that data.
Maybe the guys above 45 are buying some naughty stuff.
It could be.
Find out.
It could be. So, and again, we're seeing a fanatical user base where the users originally just love it.
So it reminded me of robmyhouse.com, which
Which is actually real.
which actually indeed is real, which just comes after howwasshe.com, but we don't want to talk about that one. Real time though, real time.
It's worse.
Jan, user model ideas, has it, for instance, changed over the years how people, you remember information foraging, how people look for information?
So when we talk about search, and especially web search, it's all about data mining of large data sets, what you can glean from this huge amount of activity that's going on. And it's fundamentally a problem in statistics, as you know. And there's an enormous amount that you can actually learn from these things. So the user model, it can actually be pretty straightforward. I mean, you have some questions that you need to ask when you have a product like search, which seems simple, but is actually very complicated under the surface. What are the specific use cases that people are actually experiencing? What are they using the product for? You can break it out into some number of situations and then dive more deeply into the data, understand in these conditions, what are people actually doing? You can track what their activities are. You can have a very good idea of what works, what doesn't work. So there's a great deal of visibility into products, internet products at this point. User models that are interesting to me are really ones around sort of detailed behavior when we talk about sort of things like clicking on pages. Search result pages have many links. People click in various places. Why do they click? What's the importance of presentation? How do you back out of the click behavior? Things like what's actually relevant, what's not. And so there's a great deal of science behind that. So it's probably the most interesting part of the product development at this time.
So as we have moved sort of from standard relevance function in search, which many people have spent lots of time on optimizing, and moved more towards the discovery, because real time certainly has more of a discovery, because often you don't actually know what you're looking for. Is there something like a relevance function for discovery? Do we know how well we are doing in surfacing up some content?
Well, recommender services are discovery services. So if you look at Amazon.com and you look at sort of product recommendations, you look at related queries services on search, you typed in this, maybe you meant that. These are all sort of, discovery services of various sorts. And they do work actually quite well. And they're not really all that complicated to understand. I mean, you just sort of keep track of what people were doing in the past. You see what you can actually monitor to see what works and what doesn't work. And it actually is quite effective. So in many ways, discovery, if you think about it as a recommendation service, is, very accessible if you have enough data.
The difficulty about that, though, is in order to get enough data, you have to have, I mean, you mentioned past.
Yes.
You have to have enough time, right? And so with real-time search, my sort of thinking, especially what we get from our customers, is that sort of 15 minutes is enough. Like if there's a blip, like 15 minutes is probably enough time. But is 15 minutes still real-time, and can you do information mining within that resolution?
Well, from a search perspective, that's what makes real-time data interesting is, how do you actually get something relevant out of it? So a lot of people would say that, well, real-time data isn't so much a search experience, it's a discovery experience. You want to browse it, you want to sort of, see what your friends are saying, and you don't really care if it's sort of garbagey or for other people or, all these, that's true to some degree. But, there are going to be instances where people are interested in searching the public real-time data and getting stuff that's very relevant to some problem they have. A lot of situations like that, you're stuck in some place, you want to know how to get out, you want to know what happened, et cetera. And it's very important to get that very quickly. And it's true that, especially for important events, there's going to be a mass of real-time data generated. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? What part is actually interesting? And that's kind of, the frontier really from a real-time search perspective is actually, finding out how to do that. And you're right, it's not going to be based on retrospective behavior of users for that particular event because there isn't any. So you're going to have to sort of think of some other signals that actually, guide things.
I would suggest that not that 15 minutes is necessarily too much to ask to wait in a lot of cases, but you can actually beat that by a fair amount just by using all of the data and the signals at your disposal. In terms of the social graph, the similarity or dissimilarity of users clicking on things that don't typically click on the same things, past modeling behavior based on content analysis and things like that. You can get pretty quick results. It's certainly a challenge to do it well, but
So
You also have I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
You also have a little more signal than a traditional monitoring because you're actually monitoring the click stream and not just the tweet volume. So if you actually have more data, so might not need 15 minutes because you have more data points in a 5-minute window.
yeah, and it's not simply, Bitly is certainly an example of that, but it's certainly not the only one. As the real-time web and social media networks continue to develop, there's more and more data out there in the open. One of the things people kind of tag and lump in with the real-time web is really not latency at all. It's an issue of openness and accessibility. So there's essentially a lot of contextual information that it's pretty easy to pull in through public APIs and various services and signals that you couldn't do 5 years ago.
Yeah. So I think relative to relevance, it seems like it's going to be based on priors. It's not so much about the datum itself, but who generated it and in what context that makes it either relevant or not relevant.
Now, I need to actually start, since I have now 7 pieces of paper which all ask the same question. And let me ask you, can you ask what that question is? How does Bitly make money?
I have never heard that question before.
Then maybe an easier one to start with here, which was sort of like a light bulb question for you. It says here, Todd, how many engineers did it take to build Bitly? Let's do that one as a startup one, and then we'll talk about
That's a
why.
good question. And by the way, we actually have 9 full-time headcount now, not 7. So.
Oh, sorry. That's not real time there, I guess.
So that's not real time yet. That was old data. So let's see. When it started internally at BetaWorks, there were initially 2 engineers working on it for the most part full-time, including myself. A couple of people who bounced in and out. So I'd put the overall initial number at 3. And even once we spun out, for a long time, our full-time headcount was only 5 people. It's only in recent months that we've grown a bit. Been lucky to work with some really good engineers who worked on a lot of things and have a lot of experience scaling similar large web properties in the past. And it made made doing it this time that much easier.
All right, now to the question.
Sure.
He told me it's $9.95, and I thought that's the monthly one, and that was right. But it's $995. So I got the decimal point wrong.
That's right.
So it's metrics for companies.
Yeah. So for Bitly Pro, there are actually 2 levels of service, so to speak. And we essentially decided that instead of charging a nominal fee like $9.95 a month for that, we would just make that free. We didn't think it was worth the impedance, and we kind of have this continued mission of providing as much transparency and analytics as possible. The enterprise version of the product is really geared more towards larger agencies and companies who have really different needs in terms of analytics and infrastructure to support that. So that's one thing that we're just rolling out right now. Actually, we started rolling out in the last couple of weeks. I think in the future you'll see us do some potentially much more interesting things around monetization, but they'll all be around adding value to the user based on monetization. We're not looking to do anything, I don't know, I guess what the word would be, massively traditional, or we're not looking to create friction with the users, and at no point are we looking to deny access to the normal data stream.
So why do the companies pay $1,000 a month? Not very much, not very little. What do they get out of it? What decisions do they base onto the monitoring?
So, so that was one thing that we talked about a little bit earlier today in class, was what drove the direction of Bitly as a product. And I relayed an anecdote. And we started pretty early on after we created the product. We started getting feedback from people who would, and keep in mind, this is early on, when most people here probably weren't even aware of Bitly. But we started getting feedback from people who said, I have a report due at 4:30 in the afternoon from my boss, and is there any way for me to get this data out in a different format? And it kind of blew us away, because we're like, we wanted to provide the metrics, and we thought they would be interesting and useful to people, but, free service, open API. We were a little surprised that people are actually relying on it to do their jobs. So we thought, well, I guess we should, it was another sign to us, and that I kind of alluded to before, is that, we needed to double down on the metrics, because that was what was providing value to people, because it was giving them insight into the functions that they were engaging in on social media. And that's not just, obviously, people who are, working in that capacity professionally. It's any end user who sends out messages. Another shift that's associated with this, quote unquote, real-time web movement is a conflation of what a publisher and a consumer is, and also the distribution channel. So it all kind of really lays into one thing.
Another question here is, with all this new communication which we have here, and the question was framed here as, are we becoming autistic? I'm just reading it here. So what is the panel's feeling about communication is changing? And in preparation for that, while they are thinking, I want to ask you a question. Can each of you please think about one person you knew in the real world before you followed them on Twitter? All right? So each of you think about a person. Now, there are 3 categories. The first one is, do you have a better relationship, same relationship? The second one, third question is, do you have a worse relationship with them right now? So I want to have a show of hands. Who now, after you start following them, has a better relationship with that specific one person you're thinking about? Right? Not very many, actually. Who has a worse relationship? Yeah, 2 of us, all right. And the rest of you, and we know this, that half an hour into the talk, half of the audience is falling asleep and the other half has sexual fantasies. But what about the rest? No effect, just different communication, or moving into autism, or what's happening? Can we have some answers here?
Or the illusion of an audience.
Illusion of an audience? Okay, so that was the dramatically changing as we have this snackable information, the status updates, the atomization of information, which is possible to create, think checking in on Foursquare, which is possible to disseminate and to consume. Now, given all of that, what do you think is the effect on communication here? How will people behave in a couple of years from now, given the real-time web, in relating to their friends, in relating to companies? So this is meant to be a serious question. How do you think this technology is changing behavior? Specifically, how do you think it's changing behavior, how relationships evolve between people and people and brands, people and companies? Todd.
That's a big question. You know, I have an anecdote, which was from the early days of Twitter, when I was talking to one of the co-founders, who I shouldn't say who said this, but I said, why do you think this is going to be such a big thing? And he said, because it makes me feel like the person I'm trying to get in touch with is really there. And it was very revealing, because this person really isn't so good at personal relationships. So for them, it was actually easier to communicate using electronic means than actually have a face-to-face confrontation with the person. So, you know, building on what you said, Andreas, it allowed them to kind of live out their fantasy of what the relationship was in their mind. And, you know, I think the set of human needs has not drastically changed over the millennia. And I think what we're seeing now is just people want to feel connected to other people. A lot of it is because they're displaced from communities or their own families, and you know, they have broken relationships with people. And some of that stuff is not really solved through the use of technology like Twitter. It may appear to be solved, and it can be helpful, but that doesn't mean it's a solution for it. So I don't think that will actually, I don't think technologies like Twitter will heal broken relationships, but I do think they can be helpful.
You know, I'm not trying to joke here, actually, and I'm not trying to be flippant at all, but I know a lot of people personally that have been involved in, you know, creation of new media, weblogs being one of them. And the one thing I find that's interesting about them is they all have personal communication problems. They don't communicate very well with people, and it's fine. People, you know, they're just not very good at communicating, and maybe that's how you invest in new companies. Just find people that are kind of antisocial, and invest in their company.
I was telling Andreas a funny story. My family is from a small town in Greece of 120 people, and I was telling my relatives in Greece about the things I do. I mean, first of all, they have no idea what I do for work. To them, they just don't get it. But I was telling about some of the companies I invest in. So they were like, explain to me this whole social network thing. I was like, well, you can send your friends messages. They're like, but I see my friends every day. And then I said, yeah, but you can send them messages. And they said, well, why would I send them messages? I'm like, well, these are for the friends that you don't see every day. And like, oh, like the people on those shows about Hollywood. So there's a bit of the fact that some of the technologies being used to connect or to deal with some dysfunction in real person-to-person communications. At the same time, I'm saying that there's just some people meet other people and get exposed to other people who they would never, ever meet if they just relied on physical proximity of discussion and face-to-face. So I think it's kind of a lot of the real-time web technologies around communication will actually create new social patterns and I think one of the biggest waves that's going to come is going to be sociological. I think there may be more change in the way our society is structured over the next 20 or 30 years than the actual, you know, how important these companies are to our economy.
I think that's a fair point, and while there's certainly a massive amount of benefit to be had from new ways of connecting people, at the same time, I think it's pretty obvious that in some circumstances, it significantly reduces the necessity for intimate conversations. If you have the ability to know that your friend just came back from a trip, or if they're sick, or if they checked into a certain location on Foursquare, in previous cases where you would have had to pick up the phone or meet somebody in person and then catch up and then, you know, kind of strengthen that bond on a one-on-one basis, if you know all that information already, there's less of a need for that tight social tie. So I think it's actually a really strong point that you're going to see different standards for what relationships mean, just as a function of the evolution of various communication mediums.
So I think my experience may be a bit different than other people. I find that indeed for Twitter, it's not particularly social experience. It's much more like reading blogs in many ways. And it's interesting if you're following a particular topic, and there's certainly scenarios in which I wish people tweeted more. You know, there's particular things that are going on. And in order to find out about it, I need to call somebody or whatever it is, and it's kind of time consuming. And if they, you know, and I know that they're SMSing somebody with the information, and why don't they just tweet it, then I could find out too, et cetera, right? So there's situations like that. But relative to relationships, I personally find Facebook much more interesting in the sense of, you know, giving a sense of community and getting a sense of intimacy with people who, you know, you'd like to keep track of, but really without a product like Facebook, the energy required to do so would be too great, but you know, here you can actually find out with relatively low amounts of effort, you know, sort of interesting little factlets that bring you slightly closer.
But couldn't you say that energy is actually a signifier of importance? If I have to expend great energy or go out of my way to talk to somebody and that's known, in the same way that writing a physical letter, especially if you do it nowadays, you know, if somebody hand writes you a letter nowadays, that's obviously a signifier. It's like this person has taken the time to make the effort to communicate.
Well, it's more than that. It's something
this
odd.
time-consuming way. Absolutely. it's very odd and novel at this point.
It's a proposal nowadays.
Yeah, but there's also the question of just learning something that you didn't know, right? So if it's very expensive to discover something about a person, you may never really realize that something's going on, and therefore never, you know, it's not in your decision set as to whether you're going to reach out. But if you kind of, you know, see these things pass by and it's sort of interesting, and, you know, people, again, it's for acquaintances who you don't know necessarily so well. I mean, I see on my Facebook page, you know, high school friends I haven't seen in 20 years or whatever, and it's just interesting to find out what they're doing. And it actually, I think, is very additive.
Yeah, on the phone with Andreas, I mentioned that a lot of the use of these technologies are to get around quote unquote political barriers. And there's about 1 million seats, there's about 1 million users of Yammer in enterprises. And some of the comments we heard back from users are, this is great because I can do an end run around all the people in my big company who aren't doing any work and meet other people in the company to start new projects. So I think there's going to be, you know, a lot of this technology is to form new groups and affiliations that can get around kind of political barriers. And I mean, that would be great because my number one goal in my job is to back someone who will fundamentally change the U.S. government. But that's a separate story.
I mean, also if you look at what happened with Iran and also just spontaneous ad hoc group forming, I think I mean, Iran was a big change politically because I think that really extended the protests over a much longer period. And, you know, if you care about democracy and political action, which I think most of us do, that's really huge. And another thing I think it's interesting is for customer complaints as well as if you just, like I really hate AT&T. And so I will, every time they make me mad, I will just be like, and I'll just tweet, I'll be like, I hate you, AT&T, and then I use the AT&T hashtag. So I feel much better knowing that someone at AT&T has a worse day because
So what I've written down here, a couple of things which I've heard. There's the sociological dimension, and if you think back, the social construction of reality used to be that others attribute features to us, like if we are African American, certain features get attributed to Asian American, etc. Now the social construction of reality is much more driven by the individual. It's the self-determination which people can show on Facebook. Which pictures about themselves do they bring up today, tomorrow? Where do they untag themselves? Which is another interesting element of the social construction reality. Future of work. I heard very interesting things there with Yammer that, you know, organizations tend to change. Why were firms invented? Because intercompany or within company communication was cheaper than between company communication. So now actually that often is the other way around. I can just, you know, call up a friend somewhere else, whereas I have to sit in a meeting at a company, which is, you know, an hour overhead. So this actually is much deeper impact on society, political impact. So what I did is I just popped up what we did in class today here, a few of the dimensions which mainly Todd pointed out here. Synchronous versus asynchronous communication. Do I expect this to be in a handshake mode, or do I just expect an answer maybe sometime? At Monitor Talent, my agent, we had a very interesting conversation going on lists. People who are used to working through lists, people probably above 25 or something, versus flow. People who are, my TA last year, he didn't last very long, as opposed to Jeremy is awesome this year. I said, hey, can you just send me another email? I'm just, I didn't get to it, just send me another email. That was not the way of getting it out. So list versus flow. Planning versus communication is a very interesting trade-off that we used to spend a lot of time planning to be somewhere to, allow for emergencies, contingencies, whereas now, and that former CEO of Metro Group told me when I first met him, this is terrible. My daughter just calls me wherever she is, and I need to find her using my mobile phone. Versus actually planning. Discoverability versus existence of data. I think that's a very important one. We talk about real time, lots of people show lots of stuff. Which of it is actually discoverable versus just existing somewhere? Persistence versus just ephemeral data, and the public versus private. I loved your point, George, here, that companies like, for instance, Get Satisfaction, making initially private instances of, Jan's point of someone texting him, to public instances where you can build layer upon layer and actually create businesses out of, the help people did. I think actually there's a third dimension to that. At Thanksgiving, a friend of mine posted on Facebook a note what he thanked his friends for. And that was actually very interesting because it was not something he publicly posted on his blog so his mom could see it or something. And it was not a text message he sent me saying, hey, Andreas, thanks for XYZ. But it's really a third dimension, which actually basically Facebook created here, which is neither public nor private. Any comments on any of the communication dimensions? These are Todd's dimensions from class here. Several people asked, what happens to our tweets? Will they be backed up? So this summarizes and provides a framework to about 5 of your yellow slips here. Anything on the expectation of communication? Somebody wants to fill in the grid?
Sure.
Pick something.
Sure. So one of the things we were talking about, obviously, was asynchronous versus synchronous modes of communication. Twitter obviously being an example of an asynchronous mode of communication. I broadcast out my status updates, knowing and not necessarily having the expectation that specific people will have to respond to me in real time. If I call somebody on the phone and they answer, they have to be present, they have to give me a response right now. You have various other mechanisms that kind of fall in between on the spectrum from email, maybe least synchronous to text message, maybe a little bit more synchronous. But all of those various media have significant impacts on the way you communicate and what you expect from the other person.
Yeah. To me, it seems critical from a data perspective to have an understanding of what the expected audience is for any particular message that's being created. Certainly from a search perspective, because you certainly don't want to expose to the general public something that wasn't intended for the general public, because first of all, it's not likely to be interesting, and second of all, it's likely to cause privacy issues, et cetera, et cetera. If you violate people's expectations, then you get into dangerous territory. So that's very important, and one way to analyze a lot of these products is in terms of what is the expectation of the consumer when they're actually using it? Who do they think are going to have access to it? Regardless of what the rules are specifically or what's allowable, but the question is, what is the expectation? And for Twitter, for example,
Which is generational, actually.
Well, it is, and it evolves over time with usage, and you'll find examples. But there's also a question of company stance, in terms of how there's a kind of continuous messaging from a company in terms of how the data is expected to be used. So, Twitter, for example, is fairly consistent about it being a public forum, right? It's default public. It's never been anything other than that. It's a general publication. You should expect that anyone will read it. And that may not prevent people from being intimate in these things, but, that's, sort of an anomaly, perhaps, right? Because it is a public thing. It's like shouting in a public space or something of that sort. As opposed to Facebook, where the expectation is quite different. It's really meant to be scoped to a circle of friends of various sort, and that makes a big difference in terms of how it's used and what the communication is. And it's also part of the reason why Twitter is an interesting data source for search, and Facebook is not so much because you can't really use it or expose it really in a sort of sensible way that would be productive.
Well, Facebook is public by default now, and I think one of the reasons they're doing that is going back to the Iran election thing. Why didn't that happen? I mean, all of that activity was happening on Twitter. It wasn't happening on Facebook. And I think one of the reasons why was that there was at least in the community, there was a perception that when you had an image or you had a video, you're sharing it with everybody. But on Facebook, there's a bit more of a social momentum that something has to take off. If you post a video, everybody has to share it with all their friends. And but again, you're also right about the public viability of it. That data is not, if there's an access control list or if it's just for your friends, you can't use it in search. So
I'll give you a quick example. We happen to have access to Facebook data that's part of a sort of company contract. And so we have this data, and it's putatively public because it's default public. And then there's this decision, well, great, it's supposedly public, but do we really want to publish it on the search engine page? And so there's, an effort that goes on to say, well, let me take a look at this particular post. Do I really think this was intended to be public or not? And so it becomes a science and kind of relevance problem to actually sort between these.
And
cases.
there's a new kind of emerging problem too, which is there's a set of privacy issues which people never consider. I mentioned Blippi before, but we're interested in this new category of company, which, as a lot of people saying, well, LinkedIn is really like the city search of resumes. There's no Yelp. Like, why aren't there companies that give or people provide reviews of you? Like, and one of the things I do as a venture capitalist is I invest in creating a network where I can get back channel information on people to find out what's the real story behind them, behind their resume. So a couple companies are pioneering this, a site basically where people post anonymous reviews of their coworkers, and
Just like reviews of product, how reliable is that?
and right there's it's the issues here are like really fascinating because the question is, at one point does slander start, and it's actually very tenuous. I mean, where is a review? What line does it stop at? I find it really interesting. There's a company called Avo, which is
How do you spell that?
AVVO. We're not investors in Avo, so I don't have any bias towards it.
Luckily, unfortunately.
I don't know actually, but Avo is really interesting because it's reviews about lawyers. And there's a ton of reviews of it.
Yay.
And the interesting thing is Avo, in its entire existence, has only been sued twice. And it's a site by lawyers and for lawyers. So I would expect them to be sued the most or have the most takedowns. So if that community is the least willing to do it, I'm curious about whether there'll be a class that basically publishes reviews about people beyond just coworkers. And it's scary territory for everyone because people aren't used to controlling their own information. I was involved in helping start a movie production company with one of my friends, and one of the things we learned is that celebrities love to control their image, and they go nuts if they can't. And I think a lot of people, just everyday people, are going to start to face the same issue.
I think you're right with everyday people. We're getting a little bit off topic, but everyday people are like that. But people in the tech industry aren't. I mean, reputation is everything. If you screw someone over, as Andreas and I know, it goes. People remember. People remember, and they don't forget. And they talk too.
So I'm now moving here because I'm getting so many things.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up briefly. So while privacy is clearly a significant issue, it's also a moving target because you have a situation where younger people are currently posting a lot of content online freely that older and current generations would never do and would be mortified at the thought of. So the medium itself is essentially impacting cultural norms and shifting what our perception of public and private are. And the other point I would make is that reputation is I would completely agree, a massive issue. Because there's more and more content out there. If I search for Andreas or if I search for Kevin, what I come back with, based on, search relevancy rankings or something like that, am I to believe that is how I should form my opinion of Kevin or not? So certainly there's going to be a massive need for tools to be built to collate and kind of determine, the canonical reputation of an individual.
It also puts pressure on the search engines to not get things wrong.
Yeah.
If it's the wrong Kevin Byrne.
Well, I mean, to some degree, of course, the data is, freely given, and it's, caveat emptor, right? So whenever you look at a review of something, you have to make your own personal assessment as to whether that information is, any way accurate. And these days, of course, with the fact that people can post anonymously, it immediately devalues the potential value of the data. You have to sort of take a look at a lot of it, and you need to do a lot of screening, and people will get more sophisticated at determining, what's a valid review from not. But it's a very interesting question as to whether you could get a really authoritative review.
So what I did here, because I'm getting so many things, I just sort of more or less randomly dished them out to people. George got 2, and if you find it interesting, then any of you picks whatever's in front of him, or looks what the neighbor has, and briefly think about what you want to talk about it. One thing which is interesting about implicit versus explicit data here on the reputation front. I've worked with a company which has some data about how people communicate with each other, should we say. And one thing which we looked at to surface within the company is how long does it take people to respond to emails, for instance. So if I know that that person has the following distribution, not just the expected value, but the following distribution, then maybe I know that, for instance, I'm hopeless for emails. So I know that, why should I actually try to email him? So by giving people, again, metrics about behavior, in this case, helping them channel, should we email that person, text that person, walk to the office, knock on the wall, helps them make better decisions. So I think that would be an example on the reputation front, which is a pretty innocuous one within the company to surface, how good are people in different real-time or not so real-time communication media. So, anybody interested in answering any questions put in front of you?
I'd like to answer George's question.
Okay, good.
Is there serendipity? The question is there serendipity in real time? Can you discover with some relevance for you? So I think the answer to that is very clearly yes. I think it's becoming easier and easier to pull that off, and I think you'll see some very interesting products from a lot of people that will solve precisely that, or will help provide some of those features in the near future. So I think that's a no-brainer.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the near future of what it is that you are planning to release?
Sure.
Irrespective of the thing. I mean, it wasn't really this question actually. Open the kimono, but none of us
I don't know how real time we want, but we actually have a product release coming out end of this week probably. It's a little more than 15 minutes, but still near future. Where initially that's going to provide a lot more discoverability and manageability around the links in your stream. We look at it as an implicit, essentially an implicit bookmarking service and an implicit capturing of your activity stream. And going forward, we plan on making Bitly a much more social service and essentially driving link discovery around the activity that's taking place for users and among their friends in their social graph.
So Jan had got 2 questions. One here is about how real-time search changes the way people do shopping, etc. Brands, pick. They are directed to you, both of them.
Yeah. So the question is, how does real-time search affect products, brands, and shopping online? So it's not so much the real-timeness. It's more a question of sentiment. I mean, sort of a very important use case that consumers have is, is something interesting? Is it worth buying? Is this, is the iPad, does the iPad work? How does it not work? And so there's a kind of there's a set of sort of questions out there that they want to have people's direct experiences. People have actually used the product. You can see that from in a variety of places that are accumulating. People try to accumulate that at shopping sites, but often it's nice to get that from your friends and to get some really kind of direct responses on these topics. So that's certainly important. So from the consumer's perspective, for companies, of course, they want to know the same thing. How is information trending? What is the sentiment about a particular event? How are they looking with respect to what people's comments are? So I think from both sides you see that. The other question here is around link data or metadata in general, and how important is it, and how it'll actually surface in in the real-time web. And in particular, the question around sort of Twitter's new annotations feature. So the ability to take a tweet and then actually mark it up in some sense and give us some metadata. Well, I'd say that, fundamentally, if someone wants search to work well, search is almost always driven by accurate metadata. So that's what makes web search engines work well, is all the metadata that gets mined out of various sources, anchor text, et cetera. Same thing would be true for the real-time web. If there was accurate metadata in terms of where this tweet originated from, what the topics were, other sort of important sort of signals, either user provided or inferred from who the user was, this is actually going to drive relevance and matching, and is very critical. So the question really boils down to how reliable is this metadata that you might get from what people offer. So if you tweet and then you provide your own metadata, it's like on the web, people putting in meta tags on their web pages. And that's actually sort of a good thing if the web page is a reliable web page, and not a good thing if you're a spammer. And the same thing would turn up on the real-time web. So it's a good idea. The real question will be reliability and quality of the data, and that's not clear yet.
The question I got is, a lot of the most successful social media don't so much replace traditional interactions as create brand new kinds of interactions. So what kinds of new social interactions do you imagine will come into being in the future? I mentioned, the Blippy idea and the review your coworker idea and review another person idea. But I think one of the prototypical case examples for a long time will be the election of Obama, which was an incredible social marketing campaign that used online media, used broadcast media, and I think we're going to see people. You will not be able to survive as a political candidate unless you become very expert at doing that. And I think social media will basically play a huge role in every political campaign going forward. And I think we're just about to see the beginning of it. We're emerging from a world of nation states into a world of groups that are states of mind. And I think we're going to see the rise of people who are leaders and crazy people and great people who appeal and build their groups online. And it's going to be a super turbulent and exciting area. And I think that the use of social media technology to form these groups and coordinate these groups at both a global level as well as what I'll call a cell level, not trying to imply terrorist issues, but at a cell level will be a huge phenomenon over the next 20 to 30 years.
My question was, how do you expect to change the world when 90% of your innovators / workers are men? Women seem to be severely underrepresented in the conversation. So I think, for one, one of the reasons that I think not 90% is a bit high, but in blogs, I think it's probably more men than women, just because men are jerks and they want to argue, and that's why we're on blogs. But I think that one of the interesting things that I don't think anybody, including Twitter, realized when Twitter was taking off. Back then, it seemed really, I thought Twitter was really dumb, to be honest, because blogs were doing very well, and why stop at 120 characters? Why not one character? That's, right? But the nice thing about 120 characters is that it seems to be really easy to do. I think that was the friction that it was removed for people, because when you have this huge blog post that you have to write, and it can't be small, it has to be a specific length. And I think that really prohibited a lot of people from wanting to adopt media, and especially social media. And so I think what's happening now is that people are saying, well, this is easy. I don't need to worry about my grammar. I don't even need to spell correctly. I just need to put a URL in there, put my thoughts, and then it's easy. And all my friends can do it. And you sign up for an account, and it's just really simple. So, I think this is really democratizing communications, because now you have a communication model where everyone, even children, can do this, and your grandparents and women and men and black and white, and even people that are in third world countries that are fighting against their government and they can't afford a major expensive computer. They can just do this on their cell phone and they can just bang it out really quickly. I think that's pretty amazing.
So, I'll actually build on it a little bit, which is, as a venture investor, I'd say 95 out of 100 entrepreneurs that approach me are male. And I don't know, if there's a solution, if it's bad or good, I honestly don't know. What I can tell you is that, you know, my incentives and what I do is I don't care backing people if they're from a different planet or if they're squirrels. I don't care. I'm interested in backing impactful innovation, and that can come from anyone, and I'm completely open to where it comes from. I don't think it has been brought up that there's a bias issue in the venture business because it's mostly male. It is mostly male, but you know, most of the really good venture people I know, they don't really care the person's background. They just care, is this really exciting, and do I want to be an investor and create a huge economic return, as well as do something that's really impactful. So.
Yeah. So Bitly's lead scientist is a woman, Hillary Mason, former computer science professor, super smart. Earlier this week, she actually wrote a blog post on this particular subject, so I recommend you all go check it out. But the crux of her blog post was start coding. And, you know, and what the point she was trying to make was that issues in sourcing talent, and I think you find a lot of people in the startup community who feel the same way, in that talent is talent, and you're looking for people who can solve the problems that you have. You know, again, whatever they look like, whatever their gender is, race, religion, whatever. And that the focus really needs to be on getting people involved in technical programs earlier on, so that they're well positioned to participate in the community.
Okay, so if somebody has a question which they think we ignored and think is really important, then get ready to actually shout it out here. While you're getting ready, you know, eat a raw egg or whatever you do before you can do that. Here are 4 more quick questions we got from you. What do you see on the horizon? How is real-time changing people? We had it a couple of times, but I saw it again and again. Is it actually driven by supply or demand? And what are the drivers of addiction? I'm taking the last one, drivers of addiction. And I think addiction works this way. You have a stake in the game, for instance, in online trading or in online dating, and the world changes, affecting you whether you're looking or not. That's where people think, oh, I need to go back. I need to see, you know, where's my next day? Scout is amazing how much addiction people show at scout.com. More on addiction in a moment. Does anybody want to take any of the other 3 questions? What do you see in the horizon? Is it real-time changing people? And is it driven by supply or demand?
I think real-time, you could say, I suppose you could say real-time is changing people, and in another way you could say it's getting people back to the way they used to be. Before the internet, you know, and accepting very, very long latency forms of communication, most conversation was taking place face-to-face, and that by its nature is real-time and conversational. You know, as the internet developed, there were real-time communication streams all throughout the way, message boards, but most of it was relatively more asynchronous and things like that. With a reduction in latency, you now have the ability to participate in conversations as they take place, instead of waiting and having to analyze and judge. So in some ways, even though it looks different, you're actually, I think you're kind of getting people back to a more natural state.
I also think that some of the ways that real-time is going to change people is what we're going to see in 10 years when teenagers that are using Twitter and social media and Wikipedia and all the tools that we have now graduate college. My daughter actually does her homework with her friend who's just sitting there on Skype, and she keeps Skype open all the time when she's doing her homework. And they just have, the kids are just going to destroy us. We're just gone.
Yeah, so before you're gone, I have 3 more minutes. I want each of you to think about the final question. What advice does each of you have for real-time entrepreneurs? And while you're thinking hard about this, I want to give my final reading about the business models. You know, basically there are 5 classes of business models, so don't be disturbed by what I'm saying right now. Do think about what we're going to say anyways. Here are the business models, and I think it's fairly simple, and it's important that you know, each of you who wants to start a business, which one you're in, all right? So, first, there are prostitutes. people who sell time. Secondly, they are drug dealers, people who sell products. Thirdly, they are pimps who sell people. Fourthly, they are priests, professors, people who sell the future. Then there are pornographers or publishers, particularly important in this zero-time latency, zero-time magic. Because Hiroshi asked me to show, what is it called, chatroulette.com, but I was worried about ICO here. And then finally, we have gamblers selling risk. As long as you know which of the groups you're in, I think you'll be doing fine.
By the way, Andreas, it's really rude of you to associate, like gamblers and pimps with priests. That's just offensive.
And professors, in that list, what advice does each of you have for real-time entrepreneurs? You each have 1 minute here. Jan, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, it's all about the data. So if you're going to do a real-time play, it's critical that there's actually something interesting and unique in the data that you're collecting or getting people to provide you something that is hard to replicate, something that actually solves people's problems that people are interested in looking at. And that's really, in my view, would be the heart of a really successful business. And if it's really just building on someone else's data, I think it's going to be difficult in the long run to be terribly successful because it's too easy for other people to do that. But if you actually have some unique and proprietary data, then it's another issue altogether.
For me, I'd say, the focus has to be the end user. Focus has to be the consumer. What are you actually facilitating? Are you just looking at something as an arbitrage opportunity or something you could skim off the top, or are you actually looking to provide real value? Are you facilitating a new kind of communication? Are you lowering friction for communication? Are you providing more insight for users so that they can make better decisions around the content they're publishing, or do the same thing for publishers? Certainly the latency is a significant issue, but nonetheless, you're talking about driving decisions. And you need to, unless you're providing value that allows people to make decisions based on the communications stream, then you're not actually adding a lot of value to the ecosystem.
Mine's all about be flexible and stay small and get to market as quickly as possible. So I'd say have a small team. Don't overcapitalize your business. It's like eating too much. It's a bad mistake. You have digestion problems. Establish what is called a quote-unquote minimal viable product. Do not overfeature the product. Launch the product and just iterate and establish as wide a base as quickly as possible, and then figure everything else out.
Yeah, the minimal viable product is interesting because the great thing about it is I think as an entrepreneur, you've just got to admit that your audience and your customers are way smarter than you are. And in fact, to be honest, I don't even plan our features anymore. Our customers do it. We just wait until a half dozen of our customers say they want something, and we do that. And every time I think of something, they don't want it. So, if you just say that's fine, and just keep throwing things against the wall. And if you have a minimal viable product, you can just say, okay, we think we can make money at this. We don't know. You throw it against the wall, and if it sticks, that's awesome. If it doesn't, just walk away and you do another company in 6 months. It's not a big deal. The other thing is try to, once you get a product and it's actually making money, try to figure out what the market size is, how much cash you can make, and then based on that, you can figure out if you should raise venture capital. So it's not for everybody, but if you have the right business, it can make sense. If you just have a cash cow, maybe you do what we do. You don't raise VC, and that works out perfectly.
So on that note of real time, we have come to the end of our time here. Once again, Kevin Burton, George Zachary, Todd Levy, and Jan Pedersen, thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, and thank you for your time.